This film depicts normal and abnormal operation of the Boeing 737 by a single pilot. At this point, he's accomplishing his taxi takeoff checklist, having just received clearance to enter the active runway and commence his takeoff. On this particular takeoff, the pilot flying will simulate an engine fire at V1 and take the appropriate actions to correct that malfunction. The takeoff roll is now commenced. Takeoff thrust has been set. Power is being monitored, and the aircraft is accelerating. That was V1. The engine fire and abrupt reduction of thrust was simulated by the pilot flying. Aircraft is now lifted off the runway. Positive rate of climb has been established and the gear has been raised. Minor corrections to rudder trim are now being made to compensate for the asymmetric thrust, and the pilot is now running the engine fire checklist, the vital actions required to be done from memory. And at this point, to verify his complete accomplishment of the required items, he will read the engine fire checklist and verify that all actions are complete. Aircraft has continued accelerating and flaps are being raised to the next position above the takeoff setting. The simulated actions here are thrust lever closed, start lever to cut off, engine fire switch pull, engine fire switch rotate, APU bleed off, isolation valve closed, to be followed by starting the APU and adjusting fuel, electrical, and anti-ice as required. Radio communications with the tower are being handled normally. Clearance has been requested to return to the outer marker for an ILS approach, and flaps have been raised to the 0 position as the aircraft continues to accelerate. The aircraft is now starting a right-hand turn to return to the outer marker. Captain is adjusting his flight director and heading selector in order to return on the proper heading to the outer compass locator. Again, a small adjustment in flight director pitch. Aircraft's right turn continues. At this point, the pilot is attempting to engage the autopilot. Some malfunction there, and he's unable to engage it. So the aircraft is now operating on one engine with no autopilot, and has just this moment simulated a runaway trim condition, which calls for shutting off both main and autopilot electric trim motors, extending the manual trim handle, and then reading the runaway stabilizer checklist. At this point, pilot notices that A-system hydraulic quantity has gone to 0, so he's taking the appropriate actions for A-system leak or loss. A-system power controls to the standby rudder, A-system spoilers off, A-system pumps off, and of course, before he takes those actions, control wheel was neutral and speed brake was checked as being down and in the detent. At this point, he will accomplish the A-system leak or loss checklist to be sure that no items have been overlooked. So as we've seen, we have now a single pilot in a Boeing 737 on one engine, having had a simulated engine fire, followed by a failure of the autopilot, followed by an A-system hydraulic failure, and a runaway stabilizer. At this point, he has armed his alternate flap master switch, placed the selector in the flaps 15 position, and he is momentarily depressing the alternate flap switch to extend his leading edges and also extend the first increment of trailing edge flap. Clearance for an ILS approach has been obtained, and this will be accomplished using the full flight director. He's continuing to extend trailing edge flaps to the 5-degree position. The loss of the A-system hydraulics means the aircraft is operating on 1/2 of its power control system, but no problem in handling is experienced. From time to time, additional flap extension will of course call for adjustments in stabilizer trim, and this too is easily accomplished with the hand wheel. At this time, the aircraft is commencing procedure turn outbound, and the captain is continuing to extend flap as required. With added drag, small increases in thrust will be necessary. Communications with the tower continue normally. The aircraft is continuing approach, minor adjustments to the flight director, minor adjustments to thrust, and continuing flap extension. Aircraft is now inbound on the final approach, and 15 flaps is now being selected as the appropriate setting for a 1-engine inoperative and A-system failure. The A-system inoperative descent and approach checklists are now being accomplished. Ignition on. The recall portion of the master warning system. The EPR bugs for go-around thrust. The airspeed VREF setting. And auto approach has been selected on the flight director mode selector. Again, slight adjustments to trim. Pilot is now extending the landing gear manually, as he has no hydraulic system to do it. After observing that 3 green and 3 red lights are illuminated on the landing gear annunciator, he'll place the landing gear down, the red lights will be extinguished, and the green lights will indicate that manual extension successfully locked the gear down. At this point, he's reading the landing checklist appropriate to the abnormal conditions which obtain. He's armed the speed brake, makes a small adjustment to trim, continues the checklist, and the aircraft is well stabilized on final approach. The middle marker is now illuminated at approximately 200 feet above the runway, and the single engine approach and landing is committed. touchdown and single engine reversing. And as we've seen here, a compound, abnormal, and emergency situation presents no problem for the average pilot to handle without assistance from either the co-pilot or any other occupant of the cockpit.